So tomorrow morning I'm defending my dissertation. Um, I've been writing this thing since about November. Obviously the research that went into this goes back probably 5, 6, 7 years. So this has been a long time in the making, and I just wanted to sort of off the cuff try to think aloud about what I might want to say to summarize it tomorrow. It's a 250-page document, and I want to be able to lead everyone through the arc of my argument. And it's not an easy thing to do in 20 minutes, but we'll see what I can do here. So the title is a bit of a mouthful, and I think I'll unpack each of these words to get things started here. Sorry about that. So the title is Cosmotheanthropic Imagination in the Post-Kantian Process Philosophy of Schelling and Whitehead. Cosmotheanthropic Imagination in the Post-Kantian Process Philosophy of Schelling and Whitehead. Cosmotheanthropic is a word that I'm borrowing from Richard Tarnas, who, along with several other scholars, sort of coined this neologism in response to a term and a concept elaborated by Raymond Panikar. And he wrote a book called the Cosmotheandric Experience, and referred to the Cosmotheandric mystery, the Cosmotheandric principle in many of his works. In this alternative rendering, Cosmotheanthropic is replacing the masculine form of the Greek word aner that becomes andric in Panikar's original word with anthropos, which has a more neutral, gender-neutral connotation. So cosmotheanthropic. Now, what does this mean? It's a sort of, as Panikar describes it, a sort of Trinitarian entanglement between these three, let's say, modes of existence that, while they're independent on the one hand, in the sense that we can distinguish them and refer to them as, there's the cosmos, there's the human, and there's theos, the divine. While we can distinguish them, they're independent, they are at the same time interdependent, because whenever I try to understand what the cosmos is, if I do so outside the context of, or without referring in some way to the human being and to God, then it's hard to triangulate, if you will, what I might even be talking about when I refer to cosmos. Similarly, when I try to get into what it means to be a human being, when I study the human and pursue an anthropology, if I don't situate the human being within a sort of cosmological context and a sort of theological context at the same time, what am I really talking about, right? And similarly, if we're going to do theology, we're going to need to understand what the human being is, and we're going to need to understand what the creation is, what the universe is. So the cosmotheanthropic mystery or experience or principle, as Panikar refers to it in these various ways, it's he says, a kind of mystical insight whereby we see the interpenetration, the mutual, reciprocally arising meaning of these three terms. And by referring to the cosmotheanthropic imagination, I'm offering yet another way of what I guess liturgizing this mystery, the cosmotheanthropic mystery. And imagination is, I think, what would we call it, a faculty or a power or a creative source that is itself mysterious. And what I'm trying to do in my dissertation is trace the history of at least mostly modern philosophy, and pursue imagination, um, as though this were a kind of crime novel, and Western philosophy was one of the suspects in this murder mystery. Um, Imagicide is the crime, and I look at mostly Kant, but also Descartes and David Hume, Spinoza and Leibniz a little bit, and I try to see how they dealt with the power of imagination um, as they develop their philosophies. But principally, yeah, I'm focused on Kant. This is Cosmotheanthropic Imagination in the post-Kantian um, philosophy. And I'm bringing Kant into conversation with these two other, I'm calling them process philosophers. Usually Whitehead is associated with process philosophy, but it's clear that Schelling shares many of the same um, underlying ontological commitments as Whitehead, to becoming rather than exclusively to being, um, and to aesthesis, to our experiential encounter with, the ongoing genesis of reality. They both share this process orientation, and in bringing Kant into conversation with them about these big ideas, the cosmos, the human, the anthropos, and theos. I'm trying to, imagine a new way for the philosopher to get at these big ideas after Kant's critique of our ability to know the world, to experience reality. So I then, in the beginning, in the first chapter, really dive into Immanuel Kant's thought, and I show how he broke up the human organism into these three faculties: thinking, which he critiqued in his first critique, the Critique of Pure Reason; willing, or desiring, which he critiqued in his second Critique of Practical Reason; and feeling, which he critiqued in his third and final Critique of Judgment. Um, I examine each of these faculties and show how, while Kant tried to approach them as separate, isolated faculties, that in fact each one depends on the other two in order to accomplish the task that it is given. And Kant recognizes this, of course, but he doesn't thematize it, and so you're left with the impression, that the human organism, that he's dissected the human organism and made our way of understanding the world and acting in the world seem, on the one hand, mechanical, and on the other hand, so spiritual that it no longer really even shares a destiny with the natural world that appears around us, right? So, in other words, when he critiques our capacity for thinking, he does not allow us to have knowledge of living nature, of organic nature, utilizing the categories of our understanding. Instead, he says we can only understand nature, we can only think nature in mechanistic terms. And that when we look at the living world around us, we're seeing a form of causality that transcends our capacity for knowing. For Kant, there couldn't really be a science of biology, because he said there could never be because for Kant science was always mechanistic, right? So he said there could never be a Newton of the grass blade. Certainly after Darwin, we would say there is a sort of mechanistic way to get at the causality operative in the biological world. I think, if you consider Darwin's theory of evolution in the context of the of Herder and Goethe's and Schelling's understanding of evolution even earlier, on the continent earlier than Darwin in England, I think you'll get a broader sense for what evolution really means, and see that if Kant was alive and did, learn about Darwin's theory of evolution, he would have said, this is not an explanation for life. You haven't succeeded in making biology a science, a mechanistic science, because Darwin assumes the living, self-organizing, self-causing organism in order to then explain how speciation is possible. So it's a mechanical explanation for speciation, perhaps, but not a mechanical explanation for life as such, right? So ontogeny, in other words, has not been touched by the Darwinian mechanical explanation, while phylogeny, the evolution of species, Darwin does offer some explanation for how that could work. But what I try to do with Schelling and Whitehead, and show that actually science need not be mechanistic. Science can develop new organs of cognition, new categories of thought that will allow it to perceive, to understand, to know nature as a community of subjects, as a community of creatures, living creatures. There's a science of life that Kant was unaware of, but that, beginning with Schelling and his Naturophilosophie, and even before Schelling, in Goethe and in Herder and others, there was a new organ of cognition blooming within the human soul, gaining access to this dimension of nature that in my dissertation I refer to as the etheric dimension of nature. And, in the subsequent chapters after this initial confrontation with with the limits that Kant placed on our knowledge of nature, I really try to unpack the alternative cosmological, backdrop that Whitehead and Schelling articulate for the human being. And I conclude this dissertation then by talking about their theology also. So, through the arc of the entire dissertation, I'm kind of beginning with the anthropological by looking at Kant's critique of our human means of knowing the world and acting in the world. And then in the second and third chapters, I'm looking more at the cosmological framework that Kant employed, and contrasting it with the one that Schelling and Whitehead employed. And then in the final the final epilogue, really, I begin sort of offering a theological, liturgy, really is what I call it, a religious liturgy that tries to make the ideas, the philosophy of the process philosophy of Schelling and Whitehead real for people's actual lives, for our existence as members of communities, for our existence as individuals, to give us a sense of meaning and purpose in the social and political spheres in which we move, the economic spheres in which we move and get our food and so on. So I try to really ground things in our practices, and imagine a new role for philosophy in a civilization that took this cosmotheanthropic mystery seriously. So how many minutes? That's 15 minutes. Okay. So I was rushing through a lot there. I can probably slow down and unpack a bit more. But anyways, if you've listened to my ramblings thus far, let me know if something especially doesn't make sense, or if I'm moving too fast, so that I know where I need to unpack more. But yeah, that's a quick summary or introduction to my dissertation here. Thanks for listening.